Welcome back to the Bible and Beyond, where I'll talk about the Bible a little bit at a time so you can really get to the heart of it, and beyond the Bible, the whole history that follows it, tying everything together, looking at all the historical resources we have so we can really get things into context, understanding the Scriptures better, especially from the eyes of the earliest church. I was explaining in my introduction to this whole series, I really want to get to the heart of the earliest church. I'm sure everybody wants to know what that must have been like, to be with the apostles, right at the feet of the apostles, right at the feet of Jesus, and to know what life was like in the first century A.D. as the church. In fact, a lot of the splits that you see in the church were created in an effort to get back at the original gospel. And what we really want to do here is, without having any church agenda, just study the Scriptures and look at the evidence that we have in the historical church with an eye to enhancing what we have in the message. Not to changing the message, but to really lifting it up through more information. That's all it really is. That's what I want to do. That's our whole approach here at the Bible and Beyond. And today we're going to be looking at the Epistle of James. But before we get into the text, I want to inventory through a few of the basic tools and an outline of the early church history that we have that are going to give us the resources that we need in order to do this kind of work, to do this kind of study. First off, I want to introduce you to the Ante-Nicene Fathers series that are produced by Hendrickson Publishers. There's actually 38 volumes in total, but there's 10 that are devoted to the Ante-Nicene, the Council of Nicaea, anything prior to that council, 325, that was convened through the Emperor Constantine. And all of these many bishops, there were hundreds of bishops that attended from all over the world at the time. Nicaea is a little place that's right next to Constantinople along the Black Sea. All the history that was before that is a lot less suspect to manipulation by the historical churches that took over after the empire had so much influence on it as people would think. I don't know what side you take on those issues, and it really doesn't matter, because here we're just going to be looking at texts in and of themselves. I'm really trying to take a basic overview of things that will help you to fully understand. And the objective will be to come together into greater unity by understanding. Now, the truth can set you free, so let's see if we can work to make that happen in prayer and in thought. James is a little bit hard to study if you're looking at the New Testament itself, because there are several people named James, and sometimes it gets confusing. There's James, the brother of John, the sons of Zebedee, who were apostles. There's James, the son of Alphaeus, who was listed among the apostles. Then there's James, the brother of the Lord, and we wonder whether James, the brother of the Lord, is the same as the James, the son of Alphaeus, or the son of Zebedee. Which one is he? Well, we know that James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded at a very early date, so we can eliminate him, so to speak. And James, the son of Alphaeus, on the other hand, is sometimes supposed to have been the writer of the Epistle of James that we're going to be studying here. And then again, there is yet another James that may have been one of the 70, even possibly the leader among the 70, who may have been a relative of Jesus. Now, of course, if we say that James was a relative of Jesus as a full brother, then we're knocking out the possibility of the perpetual virginity of James' mother, Mary, the mother of Jesus, the mother of the Lord. So that becomes a little bit of a theological sticky point for some of the churches, and may have influenced the decision as to how we're going to color the history here. But we're not going to take the approach that it really matters whether he was a direct brother of the Lord, or whether he was a brother through a former marriage of Joseph, or whether he was a cousin. Maybe he was the son of Cleopas. There's other Marys other than Mary, the mother of Jesus, and a lot of possibilities exist, and a lot of things have been said which we don't have to go into in detail here. You can study up on it. It's fascinating, but it's going to be quite a bit of work, which we don't really have to do. Now, I want to go through the basic tools and resources that you have. There's not too many of them, so in one quick lesson, we can cover a whole lot. And it's made easy these days because a lot of scholarship has gone into translating into English for us lay people the ability to really comprehend this quickly. First off, I want to introduce you to this Hendrickson series. Like I said, it's a 38-volume series, and the 10 volumes that are devoted to the Ante-Nicene period, the period before 325 AD and Constantine, are a fairly quick read and cheap. You can get them online for free, and you can get them offline the old-fashioned way for about $100. So don't pay too much for them. They're about $10 a series. And this first volume in particular, wow, you can see how I was going to close it up. I've read it a few times here, so it's falling apart. I need to get another one. It really is something for you to devour if you really are interested in that first century AD, because these are done in a roughly chronological way and also by geography. Really very nicely set out with some good background and commentary for you. So in the first volume, you've got a couple of fathers that we can look at. It has the Epistle of Clement to the Corinthians. It has a Epistle of Methetes to Diognetus. Polycarp, the Bishop of Smyrna. Also Ignatius of Antioch is included in here. He wrote a number of epistles, and it also has the Epistle of Barnabas. You may have heard of that. Paul's companion Barnabas is who that's attributed to. There's another man named Papias, who was an ancient writer who loved sitting at the feet of the apostles the way that I do. I have to do it through their writings. He wanted to see living people and be able to ask them questions and get things clarified. Justin also, who was a martyr from Caesarea, is included. All that's just in this first series, and also the writings of Irenaeus in a first part anyway, and the fragments are included just in this first volume. And there's 10 volumes like that, like I said, and there's many early church fathers, as we call them. They're fathers of the church because everybody else always referred back to them, and these early church fathers had an incredible influence on the rest of the church, or at least used as a source text or a proof text, because these were the original authorities. Yes, the scriptures were an authority, but the early church fathers quoted the scriptures, and there's so many copies everywhere because they quoted them thousands of times. And that's where the earliest copy and proof of the scriptures that we have comes through those early fathers. They wrote in many different languages and in many different geographical areas. And also, we have a lot of consistency of the text. We see that it wasn't changed a whole lot from place to place, and that it was preserved. That's important to know, that the scriptures have integrity this way. But more than that, I think they really show us a lot of context and perspective. The more eyes on something, the better understanding that we can have, and that's where their value really comes. So again, the resources, number one, Hendrickson. Number two, there's a early church writer. His name was Eusebius. He was writing the early 4th century, late 3rd century, and he was a bishop from Caesarea. Maybe he didn't know the Semitic languages particularly well, even though he was from Caesarea, which was a Semitic area, because Greek had fully taken over by then. And he was working essentially for Constantine too, so his works might be somewhat influenced by Rome. You know, you had to get paid by somebody. So it wasn't an easy time for any of these people. But he was a genuine historian. He really wanted to show the whole history of the church. And quite frankly, it's a good read. He really will give you a good continuation point from the Bible to the next stages, one era at a time, and really integrates a lot of different writers and sources into his material. He doesn't always quote all of his sources, which I wish he would do. There's a lot of stuff that's missing from Eusebius, but there's also a lot there that'll give you a kind of gripping story. So I would recommend that if you were going to study the early history of the church, start with Eusebius. Let him give you a feel for it, and then after you've read that, then go to the Ante-Nicene Fathers. There's a couple of other key sources that you'll want to know. Some of them are source texts, and in fact, the early Fathers are among Eusebius' source texts, and they do complement each other quite well. Josephus is an example. Now, actually, there's two Jewish fellows. One's Josephus, and the other one is Philo. Philo was an Alexandrian Jew from the early 1st century, the time of Jesus. I'll tell you what, it is really deep, Plato, Platonic, as in Platonism, as in Plato's influence in the 1st century, taking place especially in Alexandria. That's where you might talk about the Hellenization, Hellenized Jews. Philo is the key person in all of that, had a tremendous influence on early Judaism and also on Christianity. You see some descriptions in both Philo and in Josephus of the Essenian community that was active in Qumran. People think that the Essene community was the community from which maybe John the Baptist had arisen. There's a good article by a fellow named Robert Eisenman, and this ties in also to James because he was thinking that this Essenian community might have something to do with a group called the who was a party of the circumcision that Paul was talking about in the Epistle to the Galatians, this party of the circumcision, and James. So Eisenman tends to pit James against Paul, and a lot of the Jews will say that Christianity is a new doctrine invented by Paul. Well, I'd like to show you that James and Paul were preaching the exact same thing. We're going to see that very clearly, actually, as we go through the text. So that's not going to be the case at all. But we do want to know that there were these different perspectives that were contributing to the whole. So this party of the circumcision did exist. How exactly they were connected with James, maybe nominally. Sometimes there was this tendency to associate with a well-known person without actually having that person truly endorse you. So a strong possibility that Eisenman's quite correct about that. He's a very important figure. I want to talk to you about scholarship in general and how that all applies here. First off, this is not going to be a deep, heady study. I'm going to try to avoid that as much as possible, and understanding that the people that I imagine are going to be watching this YouTube series are not well-read in particular. You're interested in the early fathers and understanding the scriptures better, but you don't necessarily know Greek and some of the ancient languages like Hebrew, Aramaic, and you may not be familiar with all these texts. So enough about Eisenman and Scaridi, but James, we want to really understand him well, and he's mentioned also by Josephus in one place, and some of this critical scholarship. I really need to get into this with you about that. How do we approach it? What does it all mean? Well, it can mean a number of things. It can look at linguistic criticism that's looking at the details of the style of Greek or the style of the Hebrew that's there, or maybe how Greek might not translate so well from Hebrew or from Aramaic and that kind of thing. So you have your linguistic scholars. Well, we're not going to be able to get into much of that, obviously, in a series like this. And then you also have your textual scholars. Textual meaning that they are comparing this text with that text. And we know that there was this copy of this text at this time, or we're making this assumption, and then there was this other text, and these don't quite match. And so how are we going to follow how the various texts that we're hearing about as they're quoted are matching each other? So that's always an art, and there's constant dialogue going on the internet among the scholarly community about that. Well, we can only do so much of that too, so we're going to have to skim over and summarize that part. And that ties in here. I told you about Philo, but I didn't tell you about Josephus. Here's a first century Jew, Philo and Josephus, both Jews, and Josephus wrote a history. So Josephus is a historian. Philo is an exegete. He's explaining the Torah, the 5 first books of the Bible. And he's doing it in a Greek Alexandrian fashion, giving you a flavor of what Judaism was as it was being spread throughout the world during the time of Jesus, before the fall of Jerusalem. A pivotal point, I hope you know, is that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 A.D. They really were never in control of themselves ever since the fall to Babylon. They didn't have their own kings. In any case, in the time of Josephus, who was thought to have been a traitor by the Jews because he moved over to the Roman side and got hired by them, had a modest little pension, and became the writer that they used in order to get a history of the Jews. He wrote the Jewish antiquities and also detailed the wars of the Jews. up until his own time, which ended about 100 AD. So now he makes two particular mentions that are very significant. The first is actually of Jesus, and he says he's the Messiah in some of the later texts. Here's where critical scholarship is important. Origen is another early father. He didn't think that Josephus was a Christian. He didn't believe in the Messiah. So there's some versions of Josephus that were very early that didn't include that text. And yet we find it in the later Latin texts, and we find it also in the Greek text. So that probably means that it's what you call an interpolation. When a later writer comes along and adds something to the text, like a Christian might have wanted Josephus to have said something to validate Christianity. Here he's writing this long history and very detailed, and these mostly Christian scribes are preserving the history of the Jewish people. They also would have been the ones to add these texts, so it becomes suspicious. Now, in Book 18 of the Antiquities is where you'll see this reference to the Messiah, and then in Book 20, you'll find a reference to James, which is what we're going to be reading now out of chapter 9. I'm going to read to you Josephus's account, which Eusebius will cover a little bit, and also he covers Hegesippus. What we have of Hegesippus, unfortunately, has not fully survived. It's come through Eusebius, so we get what you call a fragment. Fragment is something that's preserved not through its original, but through somebody else who's quoted them so that we know that the source exists. So those are your basics of studying and how to approach the whole history. You have these pivotal points. You have the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The crucifixion, let's put that at 33 AD for simplicity's sake. And the birth of Christ, well, Irenaeus thought that Jesus lived to be almost 50 years old. So the birth of Christ could have gone all the way back to 11 BC. A lot of people laugh at that. They assume that Jesus lived to be 33 years old and that was it. But truth be told, if you study it even further, you realize actually that Irenaeus may have been right about this. So there's some interesting things that you will find as you study. Now, Josephus is giving this account about what happened with James. And I want you to really hear carefully what happened there, because the account that Josephus gives is going to be very different than the one that you hear from Eusebius through a man named Hegesippus. We'll get to Hegesippus in a second. First, Josephus. And now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea as procurator. But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood. So he removes the former high priest. He says he bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Ananus, who was also himself called Ananus. Now the report goes that this elder Ananus proved a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God. Well, that is pretty fortunate, because I think there was a little bit of pay that went along with that and prestige. And he had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, so he got elected twice, re-elected or reappointed, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. This is Josephus talking. But this younger Ananus, Ananus' son, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders, above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. So, in other words, as soon as the procurator is out of town, they call a Sanhedrin so that they can do what they actually want to do, which here you'll see. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king, Agrippa, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more, for that what he had already done was not to be justified. Nay, some of them went also to meet Albinus, as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Whereupon Albinus complied with what they said, and wrote in anger to Ananus, and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he had done. On which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him. So he got defrocked, and he was replaced by another high priest. So they were doing some very naughty things while the procurator was out of town. That's Josephus's account. Now, I've looked at the original Greek on this, Josephus wrote in Greek, and his works were translated into Latin from the Greek, so the Greek would be the original, but we don't know if we have the original Greek. All I can say about this is that when it comes to the theory of interpolations, if you have a text that's written in several different languages, the possibility exists that there was original source text from which these were copied and then later translated, and if that version of it had an interpolation, well, then everybody gets the interpolation. Whereas, if you want a more original copy, and you perhaps had suspected that the Latins, for instance, had included this account of Jesus, who was called the Christ and the brother of James, then you would think that maybe that text would appear in the Latin, but not the Syriac or not the Greek. Okay, well, in this case, it's appearing everywhere. And so, of the texts in Josephus that refer to Jesus the Christ, this one in chapter 20 of Antiquities is not suspect, whereas the one in chapter 18 is. So there's the lowdown on the textual criticism concerning this account from Josephus. So Josephus is a third party who is acknowledging that Jesus was a person, and we know that some people don't even agree with that. And I guess they don't realize that there are a lot of texts that will back up the account of Christianity. You don't hear much of that on TV, and that's sort of sad. There's a lot more to this than we're hearing. So that's why a study of the early church fathers is very important. If you get into the history, you'll know that these things exist. You'll know where to find them. Also, this history of the church by Eusebius, you can cut it up a lot of different ways, but there's still a lot of meat in there. And one of the source texts is Hegesippus. So let's get into Hegesippus' account, which is very different. Whereas Josephus is a Jew, Hegesippus is Christian and a bishop in the Christian church who was from the Hebrew tribes, presumably. Eusebius seemed to feel that he had quite a command of Hebrew, and maybe he wasn't the best judge of that, but he spoke the original Semitic languages, Aramaic, and he was involved in the church in Jerusalem, and then he went about to visit Rome. He took a journey all the way to Rome and talked to the bishop in Corinth. So you'll see a lot of references to Hegesippus, and some of Hegesippus' works were quoted all the way up till about the 7th and 8th century, but unfortunately we've lost them. I'm not sure why they got lost, how something so valuable as a document could be lost at such a late date, but many of the early Christians quoted from him for a very long period of time. He had apparently a commentary in 5 volumes, it was memoirs, a lot of material, and from the 5th of these comes an account of the death of James, which is essential for our understanding right here. So let's get into that. James, the Lord's brother, succeeds to the government of the church in conjunction with the apostles. He has been universally called the Just, from the days of the Lord down to the present time. For many bore the name of James, but this one was holy from his mother's womb. He drank no wine or other intoxicating liquor, nor did he eat flesh. No razor came upon his head, and he did not anoint himself with oil. It sounds like a Nazarite, doesn't he? Nor make use of the bath. Well, he was obviously living a very isolated life. He alone was permitted to enter the holy place. Now, Jerome, a 5th century writer, actually thought that because of this statement, James was a high priest. Well, we didn't see that in Josephus. I don't think that James was a high priest, but it's saying he was permitted to enter the holy place. And I'm not sure how that happened. We know that the veil was torn when Jesus was crucified, but we're not sure what full effect that had. Jerusalem was still in existence when James was there, so Josephus relates, and Hegesippus as well, you'll see. So this is prior to 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple. And now he's allowed into the holy place. He's considered very, very holy and just. So he did not wear any woolen garment, but fine linen only. So he wasn't like John the Baptist wearing camel hair that hurt himself. He's wearing fine linen. He alone, I say, was wont to go into the temple, and he used to be found kneeling on his knees, begging forgiveness for the people, so that the skin of his knees became horny like that of a camel's, by reason of his constantly bending the knee in adoration to God and begging forgiveness for the people. He was like a Daniel, always pleading on behalf of his people, and I think on behalf of the Christians. Now look at this situation where the Jewish people are massacring all of the Christians, and you could see why there might have been a good reason to pray. Therefore, in consequence of his preeminent justice, he was called the Just and Oblius, which signifies in Greek defense of the people, and justice, in accordance with what the prophets declare concerning him. Now some persons belonging to the 7 sects existing among the people, which have been beforehand described by me in the notes, asked him, "What is the door of Jesus?" And he replied that he was the Savior. In consequence of this answer, some believed that Jesus is the Christ. But the sects before mentioned did not believe either in a resurrection or in the coming of one to requite every man according to his works. But those who did believe, believed because of James. So when many even of the ruling class believed, there was a commotion among the Jews, and scribes and Pharisees who said, "A little more, and we shall have all the people looking for Jesus as the Christ." So Jesus was being described as the door. And this is really what opened things up for James and the problem with his martyrdom. They came therefore in a body to James and said, "We entreat thee, restrain the people, for they are gone astray in their opinion about Jesus, as if he were the Christ. We entreat thee to persuade all who have come hither for the day of the Passover concerning Jesus. For we all listen to thy persuasion, since we, as well as all the people, bear thee testimony that thou art just, and showest partiality to none. Do thou therefore persuade the people not to entertain erroneous opinions concerning Jesus. For all the people, as we listen to thy persuasion, take thy stand then upon the summit of the temple, that from that elevated spot thou mayest be clearly seen, and thy words may be plainly audible to all the people. For in order to attend the Passover, all the tribes have gathered hither, and some of the Gentiles also." So here we have this perfect opportunity for preaching on Jesus. And guess what happens? Instead of keeping his faith hidden so that he's preaching to the Jews and to the Christians secretly, now he's going to bring out his Christianity openly, realizing this is his opportunity to convert a lot of people, and he's going to take it. The aforesaid scribes and Pharisees accordingly set James on the summit of the temple, and cried aloud to him, and said, "O just one, whom we are all bound to obey, for as much as the people is in error, and follows Jesus the crucified, do thou tell us, what is the door of Jesus the crucified?" And he answered with a loud voice, "Why ask ye me concerning Jesus, the Son of Man? He himself sitteth in heaven, at the right hand of the great power, and shall come on the clouds of heaven." Well, where have we heard that before? That's exactly what Jesus said right before the priests, the Sanhedrin, tore their robes, and then he was crucified and martyred. We see that Jesus and James had this in common. And when many were fully convinced by these words, and offered praise for the testimony of James, and said, "Hosanna to the Son of David," then again the said Pharisees and scribes said to one another, "We have not done well in procuring this testimony to Jesus. But let us go up now and throw him down, that they may be afraid and not believe in him." And they cried aloud and said, Oh, the just man himself is in error." Thus they fulfilled the scripture written in Isaiah, "Let us away with the just man, because he is troublesome to us. Therefore shall they eat the fruit of their doings." So they went up and threw down the just man, and said to one another, "Let us stone James the just." And they began to stone him, for he was not killed by the fall, but he turned and kneeled down and said, "I beseech thee, Lord God, our Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And while they were thus stoning him to death, one of the priests, the son of Rechab, the son of Rechabim, to whom testimony is borne by Jeremiah the prophet, began to cry aloud, saying, "Cease, what are you doing? The just man is praying for us." But one among them, one of the fullers, took the staff which he was accustomed to wring out the garments that he dyed, and hurled it at the head of the just man. And so he suffered martyrdom, and they buried him on the spot, and the pillar erected to his memory still remains, close by the temple. This man was a true witness to both Jews and Greeks that Jesus is the Christ. And shortly after, Vespasian besieged Judea, taking them captive. Now, Vespasian was the emperor at the time that Josephus became. Flavius Josephus turned into a Roman citizen. So that's the account of Hegesippus. I want you to really fully understand the emotional part of all of this, the part where a person is giving their life over to Jesus to the point where they're willing to give up their life, literally, where they are ready to spill their blood, to become a martyr. Are you ready for that? Before you condemn James because he was associated with this party of the circumcision through what you've read from the Epistle to the Galatians, and you take Paul's side over James, or suppose that James is this person that's trying to force works on everybody. Let's look at the fact that this is an intense man of prayer, who loved his people, who was in a very difficult situation, trying to balance out the pressures coming from the Judaizers, the Jews, who wanted to impose the circumcision on the people, and the Christians that he wanted to minister to, knowing that the Scriptures had been fulfilled. There's a couple of texts here that Hegesippus mentions, saying that on this account that the Scriptures of Jeremiah were fulfilled. Now, we already have the prophets condemning the Jewish people, and we don't accuse the prophets of being anti-Semitic, do we? So I wonder why we put a different standard on the church when the church says a certain thing that they did caused God to judge them. It was a Semitic habit to be saying that was transferred over to the Christians, so that when the Christ was crucified and when James was martyred, all of these things were thought to be possibly God's reason for destroying Jerusalem in 70 AD, a few years later. Well, obviously, they were very close in proximity chronologically, but were they the real cause that God did? Well, nobody can really fully get into the mind of God, but there are these passages, and they come from Isaiah and from Jeremiah. The Christians then appropriated those scriptures in these contexts. Whether that's right or not, it's not in the Scriptures. These are the church fathers. So were they anti-Semites? Well, most of them were Jews. Hegesippus himself was a Jew. Josephus was a Jew, and he made a similar comment, and he never became a Christian. So before we go making too many judgments about the anti-Semitism of the early Christians, I just want to let you know that here we love the Jewish people. In this series, there's nothing about the Jewish people that we inherently hate. This was a handful of Jewish people. Maybe it was even like your Manchurian candidate for a high priest. He was appointed by the Romans anyway. So, maybe this isn't a reflection on all the Jewish people at the time. No one is ever saying that. And the Jewish people have well-meaning, good reasons for not believing in the Messiah. I know that there's rabbis now that are preaching. I guess there's one program on YouTube I found that was called Jews for Judaism. It's kind of like a backlash to Jews for Jesus. And they will give you all of their arguments for denying that Jesus is the Messiah to this day. The story really hasn't changed a whole lot. Everything remains the same today as it was 2,000 years ago. The Jews are still for Judaism, and the Christians have their perspective. We're going to focus on that when we look at James and when we compare James with Paul and how all these things fit together. Now that we've looked at Hegesippus, let's also look at James in the epistle that came before his epistle, which you can find in the 15th chapter of Acts, starting at verse 23. Just the context here, Paul and Barnabas have gone to Jerusalem, and they are consulting with the so-called pillars of the church there regarding the circumcision. How should it apply? What shall we demand of the Gentiles? And some decisions are made, and first Peter gets up and talks about his experience with Cornelius, and then afterwards James speaks, and they make a pronunciation, and finally they write this letter. It's in the hand of James, and it's in the style of James as well. It says, "The apostles and the brethren who are elders to the brethren in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia who are from the Gentiles, greetings." Now notice the style there, the word greetings, because this is the same way that he's going to start his 5-chapter epistle that we're going to be studying. "Since we have heard that some of our number to whom we have no instruction have disturbed you with their words, unsettling your souls, it seemed good to us, having become of one mind, to select men to send to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore we have sent Judas and Silas, who themselves will also report the same things by the word of mouth. For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these essentials, that you abstain from things sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication. If you keep yourselves free from such things, you will do well. Fare well." This is James' style. It's somewhat abrupt, always. You find it in this epistle, and you'll also find it in the epistle that we're about to study. So Luke would carry then this initial epistle of James, this letter. He had papers with him in his journeys with Paul, so I think that's authentic because Luke would have kept that. He also wrote the Acts. And now we'll be able to look at James directly. I hope you've enjoyed this little introduction, and that helps to really inform you and give you some essential context here. Normally, we're not just looking for the fathers to inform us about the context. We're going to be looking at the fathers themselves. But before we do that, and while we're looking at the Scriptures, we're going to let everything feed everything else. It's a two-way information process where everything is enlightening everything else. And you'll find that the room gets a lot brighter that way. In fact, where two or more are gathered together in His name, there He is in their midst. And what we're really here for is for the Logos of God, the very presence, the very wisdom and truth of God. He says, I am the truth, and the truth will set you free. So let's be set free from all our predispositions about what we think and be blessed by the presence of having all these different groups of Christians come together. The ones that were writing the Scriptures, the one that were receiving the Scriptures and living them in the first century, the second century, and so on, and become one.